Okay, so welcome. My name is Lisa Parnello, and I'm the literacy specialist at Sandhill School, which is part of Children's Health Council, where you are right now. And my role here is twofold. I'm the interventionist for any of our students who are struggling despite being in a learning differences school. Any of the kids who aren't making as much progress as we're hoping for during their groups come to me. And I'm also a dyslexia therapist and trainer for Wilson Language. And so I train teachers on how to teach kids with dyslexia using the Wilson reading system. So our presentation tonight is for how to help students who are having trouble learning how to read. So I've tried to make it kind of broad, but one of the things I would like to talk to you about is what your guys' role is, so maybe I can personalize some of these things to some of the information you're hoping for tonight. So here at CHC, we're a nonprofit. Our goal is to really help all students and children who need help, despite any barriers that they might have, such as location or finances or anything like that. So we have our agency here, and we also have a South Bay campus to help some of our students as well. And there's an initiative with Ravenswood as well. So we have a big focus on really helping our students thrive in many different ways. We really want to help them with their grit and determination, being able to advocate for themselves, and be able to get the help that they need. So our vision mission. Okay, and the main features of the kind of students and children that we work with here at CHC are ADHD and learning differences, depression, autism spectrum disorder, as well as learning differences in general. So we actually have different divisions here. So we have the community clinics, so that would be for students who are underprivileged and may not have the means and finances to get the help that they need. We have a clinic that provides free services through that way. And there's also the other division upstairs that is for paid services. So if anybody needs OT or therapy or needs outside services that perhaps their school doesn't provide, we do that here, as well as any diagnosing with neuropsych evaluations. And then we have Sandhill School, where I teach, which is for language-based learning differences. So dyslexia, dysgraphia, there's a whole lot of kiddos with ADHD as well. All working within our school, as well as EBC, which is for our more emotional and behavioral students. And those ones are usually paid for through the school districts for schools that aren't quite able to help their students and they need a place to go for more of a therapeutic school. And we are also a safe environment where everyone is welcome and very caring and compassionate. And there's also teen initiatives to really help with any sort of anxiety and that kind of thing as well. So now about you guys. Who is here tonight? So what is your role? What are you hoping to learn tonight? So that way I can add in a little extra. Anybody brave?
I'm a teacher. I teach 5th grade in Palo Alto. Just hoping to help some of my students who are reading behind grade level, of course.
I'm an aide at a elementary school in Newark, 1st to 3rd grade, of 13 students who are special needs.
I have many hats. Currently, one of my hats is I'm working with the Los Altos School District, especially with 3rd grade classroom. And I'm also an owner of a tutoring company. So I see a lot of the kids that don't get served during the day, and more and more, it's not necessarily only the executive functioning, but it is about all those other issues.
Anything specific any of you are hoping to learn tonight? Any nagging questions you're hoping you're getting answered, or just here to learn in general?
I'm interested to learn more about what are some strategies for teaching students with dyslexia.
I also teach 3rd grade, and I have a lot of kids who trauma is a big thing.
Perfect. So our agenda tonight, who's here? We just did that. Signs and causes of word attack struggles for students. Decoding strategies, meaning being able to read. Encoding strategies, so being able to spell and put those words onto paper, because sometimes the kid can read a word, but they sure can't spell it. So we want to think about it from both perspectives. Resistant students, so things where a student might have had a traumatic experience with school or home or that kind of thing, and how to help those kind of kiddos. Where do you begin as educators? Where should you start? What's a good starting point? And then professional development opportunities. So what is word attack? Word attack is the student's ability to use the sound-letter correspondence to figure out what the word says on the page in front of them, whether that is a known word or an unknown word. Frequently, you'll see the biggest struggles when a student is trying to attack a word they've never heard of before. And so a student might seem like a really great reader, and then all of a sudden they say something that looks nothing like the word on the page. And that's usually a student with a word attack struggle. They're having a hard time understanding the letter-sound correspondence. They understand how words work and that you're supposed to read them in sentences and that kind of thing, but the second you give them a word in isolation that they don't know, they have no idea how to sound it out. And that's really what we're focusing on, is how to help those kiddos who see a word that they don't know or they have to see it out of context and still be expected to read it. So word attack is one of the essential elements of reading comprehension. If you can't read a word, then there's no way they're going to understand what the story is about. Or I had one of our newer students today reading with me during our intervention time, and he was reading words, and then all of a sudden he said one that made no sense to what was on the page. And I was there, so I was able to help him go back and check and say, did that make sense? Did those letters match what you see on the page in front of you? But had there not been a teacher there, he would have just kept on going, and it would have completely changed his comprehension of the story, because the word was pretty, but he said something like pathetic. And so if you change the meaning of the story from something being pretty and beautiful to being something pathetic, that completely changes your perspective as to what happened within that narrative. And so it's really important that we help our students on how to decode those words so they can really truly understand what books are about. Because only until about 3rd grade is anyone actually teaching you how to read. After that, you're just expected to know how to read and learn new things from those books. And so we want our students to be able to look at a word, know what it means, and how to check their understanding if a word that they said doesn't match the kind of story that they're reading. So what makes it so hard? Why is reading such a challenging thing? So when we think about language, this happens naturally. As part of life, you don't have to have anybody talk to you to tell you that, we talk to each other. Little babies babble back and forth. They're not really making real words, but it's a natural phenomenon to try to communicate with those around us. We are social creatures. However, reading is not a natural phenomenon. Humans created it. We created writing as a way of tracking our culture and being able to share things and pass things down, and it is not something that our brains naturally know how to do. Our brains weren't wired to do that. And so if you think about any animal in nature, humans are the only ones that go and read books. It is not something that occurs naturally. And so we have to think about the fact that animals communicate naturally, but written words are not. So our brains, some students' brains are wired and can figure it out. Other students' brains work differently, so they can't quite figure it out. So the other big challenge is the language that we speak. English is a conglomerate of many different languages that each had their own rules, and we smashed them all together and then you get English. And so when we think about that, sometimes some of our words come from French origins, some of them come from Spanish, some come from Latin, some come from Greek, and they each maintain their own rules for how those languages work. So when you do that and you mix them all together, students see the same 26 letters, but the rules for what you say when each time you say it are not the same. In Spanish, most of the time you see a letter, you know basically what sound it's going to make. In English, that's not necessarily the case. So when we think about the big 5 of reading, our main starting foundation point is phonemic awareness. And then from there we get phonics, accuracy and fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. So if you don't know what those words are, phonemic awareness is being able to hear sounds and associate them and be able to hear where one sound ends and the next one begins, not having anything to do with a book. So phonemic awareness happens when there's no books or letters anywhere near you. Phonics is when you're applying the rules for those sounds and the letters to words on a page. And from there, we build on those words and we develop vocabulary to understand what these words mean. Once we see a word, we know what it means. There may be multiple meanings of a word. And using those skills, then we have comprehension. So the part that we are going to focus on tonight for word attack are phonemic awareness, vocabulary, and accuracy and fluency, and phonics. So those are the big components that we will be focusing on. So accuracy is being able to read it correctly. Fluency, being able to read it smoothly. If you can read a word correctly, but it took you 5 minutes per word on the page, by the time you hit the bottom, you have no idea what sentence number 1 said. And so our goal is to really help our students with their phonemic awareness and phonics so they can develop accuracy and fluency, where it's not so labored as they go through their stories. And then through that, that's how you can build the comprehension and the vocabulary. Until you get those 3 foundational skills in place, it's really hard to make any progress with the other 2. And sometimes they really do happen in a cycle, so I put them in a circle on purpose with the idea that sometimes you might know some phonics and you might develop some accuracy and fluency with some patterns, but maybe not all of them. And you're also learning some vocabulary, and then you're learning richer vocabulary, and then you're learning more complicated spelling patterns. And so it really all goes hand in hand, but essentially you need the main three components of phonemic awareness, phonics, accuracy, and fluency before you're really going to get any strong comprehension skills in place. So, time for a little quiz. So here are some questions for you to think about. How many sounds does EA make? How many ways can we spell the sound E? How many ways can we spell K in English? Why does Kindle have an E at the end? How many sounds or phonemes are in our language? True or false? Reading struggles originate in the brain. And true or false? Poor word attack skills are caused by low cognitive functioning. All right, number one, it's okay if you're not done. How many sounds can EA make? 3+. Anybody get it right? So, eat bread and steak is how I teach it to my students. You can say E like eat, bread like, and make the S sound. Steak has the A sound. I teach it and it goes in that order because you eat every day. That's all the time. Sometimes you have some bread. And every once in a while you get a nice juicy steak. So in order of how frequent they are, it usually says E, sometimes says and once in a while says A. The plus is because sometimes an E and an A are next to each other in a word, but not working as a team, such as the word create, where they each have different, say their own sounds. So EA as a team makes 3 sounds, and I did the plus to make sure that we account for the fact that sometimes they just happen to be next to each other. All right, how many ways can we spell the sound E?
5, 4, 5.
Three.
I heard 3, 4, and 5. The answer is 9. So when we think about our students and having a hard time learning to read, or even to spell, if a student's trying to spell the word with the sound E in it, there's 9 different choices of what they could do. I can tell you what they are. They are E consonant E, so a silent E. They are E in an open syllable, so just E at the end of a syllable. Y, such as baby. I, like in radio. EE, such as Jeep. EY, like valley. EA, like in eat. IE, and EI. So you end up with 9 different choices. So this is why reading and spelling are so hard for our students and why they shut down in class. Because even if they're sitting there trying to read something or write something, they could try it 3 different ways and still be wrong. So it's really important that we teach our kids how to attack our words and teach them the patterns and the rules behind how some of these work. Okay. What about how many ways can we spell K in English? 3+. There are 3 main ways: C, K, or CK digraph combined. The other very less common ones that still exist are QUE, like in click. And then the other one is CH every once in a while, like in chemistry. So it's one of those things where you teach the kids the default ones, but then every once in a while there's some of those tricky ones. All right, so Kindle has an E at the end because it has to have a vowel. So, but the syllable has to have a vowel. Kindle. The rules in English are we always have to have a vowel, so if you don't really need one, you throw in an E at the end. So anytime you need an extra little friend at the end, it's always the E. Okay? How many sounds or phonemes are in the English language? There are 26 letters in our alphabet, but 44 sounds. Because you think about all the different ways that we can mix our letters together to make new sounds. Like C and H each make their own sound, but you put them together and they make ch, which creates a new sound. And things like NG, when you put them together, give that ng sound. All right, true or false, reading struggles originate in the brain. There could be some visual processing, but that still ends up being your brain that's affected unless it's a vision impairment. So if it is not strictly a child having a vision impairment, it is still part of how the brain visualizes and perceives what they see. So with the exception of there being an actual vision problem, even visual impairments where they have trouble orienting and deciding what direction letters are going, that still has to do with how their brain processes letters and language. And then poor word attack skills are caused by low IQ. False. It can be. There are students who have a low IQ and therefore that is a contributing factor as to why they are struggling to read. But often, many students have average or above average intelligence if they have dyslexia and struggle to read. All right, does this little exercise give you a little eye-opening into the world of our crazy language? All right, so what are some signs of word attack struggles? So when we think about students learning to read and having trouble, we think about, a kindergarten or first grader, but sometimes you can even identify them even earlier than that. I have a niece who is now in first grade and just went into second grade this school year. And I knew early on that she was going to have trouble learning to read ever before she made it to school. And there are some signs that you can think about. So, trouble with rhyming. If I would play rhyming games with my niece and nephew, my nephew could get the answers right and tell me all sorts of funny things that rhyme without ever looking at a book. But my niece would give me something completely off the wall that made no sense whatsoever. She couldn't hear the sound distinction between words to hear how one sounds the same as the other. So she might give me something that means the same thing. If I said cat, she might say dog. Because in her mind, she was associating what they meant, not what sounds are distinguishing, even if you gave her repeated attempts. Slow to learn letter names or sounds. So if they're in kindergarten, they're having trouble learning to read their color words or even remember all of their different color words, even just by sight without sounding them out. They have a hard time with those associations of what the letters mean and correspond to. And learning the letter names, where sometimes they may not even know the letters in their own name. I had a little kiddo named Max my second year teaching, and I wish to this day that I knew some of the strategies that I knew now, because it took me 6 months to teach him his own name, and it was only 3 letters, and he was in first grade. And it's that idea behind being able to separate what each sound means. He just knew what the letters looked like. They had no meaning to him that letters made sounds. He just knew that there were these letters, and you put them on a page, they meant his name. He was Sam for 6 months until we could teach him the order of the letters and how they make sounds. So trouble remembering the sequence of a task. They might remember what they're supposed to do, but they struggle with the order of when to do it. Struggles with word finding. We think about this when a student knows it in their brain, but they're not able to get it out to you. One of my best examples of this is a little girl that I was working with for tutoring, and we were reading a story, and we were going through and working on sequencing and being able to retell the story. And as she's reading one of these sentences, the stories are controlled, and so there's missing some words in there just because they're trying to make sure that they only use spelling patterns they know. She's reading the words. I was like, okay, so what game are they playing? And she goes, baseball. She was able to remember what it looks like and the sound of a bat hitting a ball, and she could do that, and then she could get the word. She knew the answer, but it just took a totally different pathway to get it out verbally. And so that's one of the features of language-based learning differences that cause struggles in reading. It's something having nothing to do with the actual book. It has to do with how the brain processes language and gets the words out. Verbal struggles. This is one of the big signs of how I knew my niece was going to have dyslexia diagnosis very soon. Things like saying paschetti instead of spaghetti, but hers was nowie instead of an owie. And then the word she made up for her other grandma, I don't even know, I can't pronounce it because it is so garbly-gook, because her ability to restate language in words was something that was really a struggle for her. And so that's one of the big struggles. So sometimes the kids that say lello, if they don't have a speech impediment, of course, that is completely different. Students who have completely fine linguistic abilities, but somehow have trouble getting the words out in the right order. Or my mom says Nextflix instead of Netflix. She can see it written on page 100 times, and I can tell her the right ways 8,000 times, and she still says Nextflix, because she herself also had trouble learning to read, because dyslexia is just genetic. I never had any troubles growing up, but it very clearly skipped a generation down to my niece and nephew. So these are certain things that you don't really think about when you think about a student struggling with word attack, is that there's ways to know which of your kids might have those struggles.
So are the tests that they use to diagnose students, do they do these types of?
Absolutely. So if a student is being diagnosed with dyslexia, they do things called rapid auto naming, or RAN, and that's because it has to do with that processing of being able to get the words out. They do phonemic awareness assessments, in addition, which are just verbal, in addition to text on paper. That's why you can actually diagnose dyslexia earlier than like second grade like some people think.
I know the schools don't do it. Is this something you go through your doctor to get tested, or?
You would go through a neuropsychologist. So we have them here at CHC, and then I know Morrissey Compton does diagnosing as well. And so that's one of the things that you can get diagnosed with outside of the school district a lot of times, because they can do different levels of testing than what the school district would do, and also because it can be quite costly. So sometimes the school districts won't do it partly for that reason as well. So they do what they need to do legally by law to serve the needs of their kids. So some common signs of word attack struggles. Slow labored reading, obviously. The student's taking a long time to read something and it takes them forever and a whole lot of work. That's your most obvious sign, of course. Not wanting to read books without pictures. I don't like that book, it's boring, it doesn't have any good pictures. Sometimes it doesn't mean it's boring, sometimes it means it's hard. In fact, most of the time, if a kid says something's boring, it means they can't do it, or they can't do it without some help. And so a lot of times they're really resistant to any story that has a lot of words on one page, because it's a lot of effort to try to figure out what's happening in that story with only one picture for a long text or no pictures at all. Frequently missing the small words within a story. The small words are hard to figure out without even in context sometimes, or they don't really have any association to letter sounds, and it's really hard sometimes to pick out some of those ones, so they'll skip right on over them because they're not really following the text. They're kind of going off of what they figured the story's kind of about. Guesses based on the first letter or letters within a word. So they might say bring instead of brought because they just looked at the BR and they knew it had to do with taking something somewhere, and they figured, this sounds about right. Even though the ending letters don't make any sense if you were to switch those words out. They might swap a word that makes sense in the sentence. So they might say they went home instead of they went to the house. So if they skip over the word the, they just inserted another word that would make sense within the story, because they're not actually using an attempt to sound out the word. They're just figuring out what makes sense. And then a student reads, but they can't articulate what they read about. So they're sitting there, they're reading a book, and then you ask them, okay, great, what was it about? Well, I don't really want to tell you. I know what it means, it's fine. Or they'll give you one or two key words of what happened on the page, but they can't really give you any clear, concrete details. So a lot of times kids will kind of fake it till they make it, and they have some coping skills to try to get by in class. Whether that's because of embarrassment, or if it's because the other kid next to them might think that they're stupid, or something else, or they just don't always want to admit that they can't do something because it kind of hurts their feelings to say these kind of things. And so this is definitely one of the things to think about. And the other big one is a flight, fight, or freeze response. So this reading can be a traumatic event for a student who's always failed at reading. They're going to find all sorts of different ways to react, whether that's on purpose or not. So one of the things that they might do is they might fight you. I don't want to do this, and throw the book off the desk. They might have some sort of argument for the teacher over why they don't want to do something. They might have some sort of fight response. They might freeze and just stare at the book and not say anything at all. We have a couple kids who, when we first get them here before they learn some strategies at Sandhill, they'll sit there and just stare at their book with little tears in their eyes and not say anything at all because they haven't learned what to do. And then we teach them the skills and the strategies to kind of overcome that. But when we first get them, they have that freeze response where they're not arguing with you or anything, but they're also not even trying the words anymore. They're frozen. They can't do any more. Or they might have a flight response. Flight response, you think about running away, which can happen. We've definitely seen a couple kids who are runners their first week or two of school here. But sometimes it might just be, can I go get a drink of water? Hey, can I go to the bathroom? So they're escaping, and they're not actually in a flight response that you might notice. They're doing it in subtle little sneaky ways. Oh, I just need to go get something out of my backpack real quick. And so they might find these other ways to get out of the thing that is hard for them. They might always try to magically go to the bathroom. I had one kid who went to the bathroom for 20 minutes during reading every time, but never had to go to the bathroom the rest of the day. It was always just to get out of reading. So what are some of the causes of word attack struggles? So one of the main ones is having a learning difference. 1 in 5 students has a learning difference, and the most common of which is dyslexia. So that comes in a really big spectrum though. You have some of our more profoundly dyslexic that can't read anything, or you have some kids that can kind of skate by and you really notice it more on their spelling and that kind of thing, and they're just always bad spellers, or they might miss a few words here and there all the time. but it's not terrible. So there's a really wide gamut. So some of the kids fly under the radar, and they always sit next to their best friend who will read the word that they get stuck on, and they can get by just fine. And then you have some of the other kiddos who have a lot more severe struggles and really can't get by without help. So there's a big wide amount. There could be a cognitive impairment, so it might have to do with their intellectual functioning. And there also might be a visual processing issue. We have one little girl here who she can look at something, she can look at 2 letters, a B, a D, a P, and a Q. Every single one is exactly the same to her. There isn't a difference as to where the sides are. They all look identical to her. And if you think about it, this is a chair. If I turn it around, it's still a chair. If I turn it upside down, it's still a chair. But if you have letters, the second you turn them a different direction, they magically become something else and mean something different, and they say something different. So it's also that idea of your mindset and having that cognitive flexibility to understand that when you see it in one context, it means one thing, but when you turn it around the other way, it means something different. And it has to do with how your brain processes and maps that information into your brain. There's also lack of exposure to text. Sometimes I've seen students who've been in a different type of learning environment, maybe of more of a Montessori kind of experience, where they aren't necessarily holding books and reading them themselves very often. They might be read to and that kind of thing. So sometimes it's just not being exposed to text, or it might be a student who's low income and can't afford books at home, so they don't see as many books. They aren't hearing as much language around them, so they aren't exposed to as many things. Or maybe the text that they're exposed to is in a different language that is very different from our own and has very different patterns. So sometimes a lack of exposure to text within their level is also be a cause of word attack struggles, because they haven't had a chance to practice as much as their peers, which therefore sets them behind. They might have little to no phonics instruction. So schools have gone back and forth over the years over their approach to teaching kids to read. So there's 2 main schools of thought. One is a phonics-based approach, which is learning sounds that letters make and the rules for them and teaching it that way. The other is whole language approach, meaning that if we give you books and put them in front of you, you will learn to read them. Just naturally, you will pick it up. And that does work for some kids. So that type of style works very well for certain kids who kind of can break the code on their own. They can figure out the patterns. Oh, this says this. Every time I see it, it does this thing. And they may not have the words for it to describe it, but they can figure it out and they can read the words. But there's a good 20% of the population that cannot do it that way. That you can put the book in front of them 100 times and they will still struggle on the same exact word, even though they saw it 4 times on that same exact page. It doesn't connect in their brain. It doesn't work the same way. Another one might be over challenging text. So there's the zone of proximal development, meaning that there is a range in which you can work on your own. There's a range in which you can work with some help, and there is a range that if you're doing it with a lot of guidance, you can do even a little bit more than that. So sometimes if you put a book in front of a student that is so far out of their range, they have no chance of being able to attack it. You have to start down at the foundational level, which sometimes feels a little bit like baby books. And so sometimes kids might be resistant to staying within that range of development, but it's sometimes where they need to be. And it's something that we also have to think about when we're handing a 5th grader a text, but that student's reading it more like a 1st or 2nd grade level, and they can only read, 3 words on that page? There's no point in them even trying, because they know they're not going to understand anything. And so it's really important that we pick books and text or modify text in a way that makes it so the kids even have a chance of being able to work it out until they build up those skills. Not saying that they always have to be down a level, but until you build them back up, we might need to meet them where they are. And also, reading is just really hard work. We did that little quiz before, and we learned all the different ways that you can even just have the E sound on a page, and all the different ways that you might hear the K, and all the different sight words we might have. So we have to think about the idea that reading is just really challenging. And so that's also in and of itself, just starting at that point. So thinking about how the brain works. So thanks to functional MRIs, those are MRIs that the child can be awake and inside the MRI machine reading text, and then they can map the brain and how the brain works. So when we think about ordinary readers, they use the left temporal lobe for reading and sounding out words. Poor readers do not use the left temporal lobe to find the sounds. So This is an ordinary reader, and this is one with reading challenges. The brain itself functions completely differently. And so we can see that it's not even activating the right parts of the brain. And then a capable dyslexic reader shows a greater resilience in the right brain areas. So sometimes a student might learn new strategies because they're taught using proven effective methods. And through that, they're actually able to rewire their brain. And so their brain actually activates differently than before they had interventions. And sometimes it can actually add in the reading on the closer to what the one on the left looks like as well. So when we think about a student having a hard time learning to read, it's really because their brain's completely working differently. And so what we have to do is change the way that we're teaching completely. What really works for some students may not work at all for others. So we have to think about what are those strategies that are different for that kid that will really help them access their text. The article for this is actually quite interesting, so I put the link on here for you as well as to where this came from. And then I'd like to take a moment to play a video for you. We won't watch the whole thing though.
We've known for some time what children with dyslexia look like in terms of their reading skills, skills in areas of language like rhyming and what's called phonemic awareness. But the brain research has really added to this by showing us what the brain looks like when people read and what the brain looks like when people with dyslexia read, and there are some differences. When we think about reading, we need to remember that we are really probing a person's ability to understand that words are made up of sounds and that those sounds have a representation in their written counterparts in the letters. And this is where things can become very difficult for a child. Understanding that a word that sounds just like one continuous sound, like cat or dog, is actually made up of three sounds that are joined together so seamlessly that you would hardly know that they are in fact three sounds, and because of that are represented by these three letters.
Key takeaway. Dyslexia involves trouble connecting the sounds that make up words with the letters that represent those sounds.
Something that many of us take for granted and forget is just how complicated reading is. There's nothing about our brain that was designed to learn to read. When our brains learn to read, we rearrange them quite significantly, and we draw on a range of skills that were designed to do other things. The same mechanisms that we use when we read, which is accessing the sound representation of language, that area in the brain is involved when we read. It's clearly become directed towards reading and not just spoken language. And it is integrated with areas in the back of the brain that help us recognize words that we then at some point begin to recognize by sight, because the oral part of language is important in helping us put the sound representation on words. But after we see a certain word a number of times, we don't necessarily have to sound it out every time, but we begin to move it to a part of the brain that helps us visually support recognizing a word by sight. The more we see those words, the less we have to actually sound those words out, but we recognize them almost like a picture. And it does seem that, in fact, the area in our brain that we use to see pictures in our visual environment becomes hijacked by reading. It literally, reading as it establishes in the brain, says, move over, now I'm going to use this part of the brain to help us recognize word forms. And then we also have a part of the brain that helps us pronounce the word and pull out the right pronunciation, and that's in the front of the brain. So reading is made up of different components, and likewise what we see in the brain is a network that reflects those different components that we use for reading.
Key takeaway. Reading uses different parts of the brain to sound out unfamiliar words. Recognize familiar words by sight. Think about how to pronounce the words.
When we study children or adults with dyslexia, we find that some of those areas aren't activated quite the same as they are in people who do not have dyslexia. And the imaging research has given us kind of a very nice inside view of the reading brain and how it differs in struggling readers. And it's also given us an opportunity to ask the question, what happens in children or adults who have had difficulties with reading when they're given some tutoring and they're given the skills that they need to sound out those words, to really apply the code to allow them to pronounce the words and get better and more fluent at doing that. the research shows that if you are very explicit in instructing children about the rules of phonics and understanding how language is structured and then how it relates to the written counterpart, and if you use methods that show children in a very structured way, in a very intensive way, how that works, that really is a key component to a successful intervention. And once you understand the relationship between sounds and letters and you can read, you then need some time to become a more fluid reader. Give your brain the time to not just increase the skills in phonological processing, but also now have the experience of encountering words again and again so that you can commit them to your visual word memory and have the practice and then go on to use that skill to derive meaning. What isn't considered an effective intervention are the kinds of things that focus on trying to train eye movement control, trying to change a child's ability to balance, and those kinds of things.
Key takeaway. Effective interventions for kids with dyslexia teach the relationship between sounds and letters in a very explicit and structured way. Help struggling readers recognize words they have seen before. Do not focus on things like balance or eye movement.
Does that give you some interesting thoughts to think about? So when we're thinking about dyslexia or any sort of reading challenges, it's really important to really be explicit. And that's part of what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of our evening, is the explicit ways that we can teach our students in the ways that the brain research tells us work best, and what we can use with our students to really make those changes that help their brains rewire in a more efficient way to get to the language and the words that they need to learn. So for decoding strategies, first thing is to break apart words. So one of the biggest struggles that some of our students have is they look at the word and they try to read the whole thing all at one time. And that is not really something that's as achievable for our students. We need them to be able to see where we might break a word apart. So words are made out of syllables. And this is something that our students often struggle with, and it's why kids do clapping games in kindergarten and preschool, is because we need them to be able to hear where the breaks are between words. So they need to hear that banana is not just banana, it's ba-na-na, and being able to hear where one section ends and the next one begins. And so this is something that sometimes we have to practice with them. Sometimes they don't hear the separate sections. And so that becomes the phonemic awareness piece first, is being able to even hear it out loud. So usually the first week I have students here when they come to us, we'll start with things like our name, which sounds a little funny when you're doing it with a fifth grader, but sometimes that fifth grader never got those clapping games in kindergarten, if that wasn't something that was part of their kindergarten program or their preschool program. And so that is one of the first things to do, is to teach them that yes, there are words, but they are small sections within those words to break them apart. There's rules for how we break apart words. So we just think about where you can hear a word and how you can hear where the breaks are. A student with a language-based learning difference and having trouble with word attack may not naturally hear where those breaks are. And so if they're attacking a word on paper, if they have trouble hearing it, they might also have trouble visualizing it, where it looks like a logical place to break apart the word. As an adult, it's easy to tell a student where to break apart a word and hide part of it with your finger so that they can read one chunk at a time. But we need our students to be able to look at a word and decide, where should I break that? How I know I should break it in half, but where? And sometimes I break a word into 2 pieces, sometimes I break it into 4 pieces. How do I know how to do this? And so this is really what we want to teach our students, is not to try to attack the whole word, but just look at little snippets at a time in a way that their brain can process. And reading words without suffixes. A lot of our language uses suffixes. So even just words like walks, if they can just try to find the word walk within there and teaching them what suffixes are and how to hide them, suddenly a word that looks really scary, like if I say willingly, if you look at the word willingly on paper, it's really long. But if you think about it as only having to read will, and then you know what ing and li are, and they always make those same noises, if you cover them up, then all they have to read is that one base word, and suddenly a word that is so long becomes much more simple. And so what is the base word? So helping them find it, and also what are those most common suffixes. So typically the most common suffixes in our language are s and es, as well as ing. And those are your big three, s, es, and ing. So if you can even teach the kids to look for those at the end of a word and how to hide them and suddenly make their words a little bit shorter, it makes it a little less daunting for them. A word that they look at and they go, I can't do that. Suddenly, oh, if you cut off 4 of those letters, actually I can. And so we really want to help them see where it is. So one of these things is learning the syllable types. I have to preface this with, I was one of those kindergartners that could already read by the time I made it to kindergarten. Nobody had to teach me. I figured it out. But as a teacher here, I can't tell you the number of kids that go, Miss Parnello, do you have dyslexia too? Like, because how do you know how to teach us these things? I had a whole lot of teachers before I got to you, and none of them teach me the way you do. So the students don't even know, because I'm teaching them in a way that no school has ever taught them. The way that I'm teaching, I never learned as a student, and I never learned as a teacher until I came here. So I have an undergrad in elementary education, and I have a master's in special education, and no one taught me any of this. So it wasn't until I went into specialized programs and certifications and got training on how to teach kids to do this did I learn any of these things. So I want to preface this with the idea that even as educators, no matter how much education you have, a lot of us aren't really taught this way. So one of these ways is to work on the syllable types. I didn't even know there were syllable types. I had no idea. I taught for 8 years before I ever knew that there were different types of syllables. I just thought there were syllables. So one of the things that you're teaching a child to do is how to break those words into syllables. So you got to know what they are. So we want to get kids to be able to break words into syllables before they ever try to read them. So we use scooping. So the kids will take a pencil and write on it. Or they might do it with their eraser end of their pencil if it's a book that they can't write on, of course. And so they'll scoop and do it that way. Don't guess, ask. That is my biggest struggle when I first get a kiddo, is that they guess everything because that's what they've had to do for the last however many years until we got them. And we really want them to ask questions and figure out how to get to the answer, not just echo whatever the kid next to them said or copy it down off the board because that's what everybody else did. We want to teach them the rules behind these things. We also need that explicit instruction. So it's not just teaching phonics and randomly doing this and then that and then this and then that. There's a sequence to it to make sure that one thing builds on another and that each skill goes in an order that the next one makes sense. Sometimes if you go in a different order, you might accidentally end up with words with patterns that you haven't taught before. So if you think about different words like an AR, you might think of like words like harp, but then you might make a word like harpoon that has also OO in there. So you might end up accidentally mixing in other patterns. So there's a logic to adding things a little bit at a time. So learning explicit instruction for, there might be a sound like j in a word, but it's DGE. If you look at DGE, not one of those sounds on their own says j. It says d and g and e or e. And so this is where we need to teach them the explicit rules that when you see this 3-letter trigraph, that's when you need to say j. Every time you see this 3-letter combination, it's going to be at the end of a word or syllable, and it's going to say j. Our students with reading challenges won't naturally pick that up. You can hand them an entire worksheet, and you can say, but look, they did the whole worksheet. That might just mean they looked at the worksheet and they saw everything ended that way, so they wrote it down, but that doesn't actually mean you explicitly told them the rule for it. When we hear j at the end of a word, English doesn't let you end with the J. It's not allowed. So we have to use GE, or if there's a short vowel, we have to do DGE to make sure our vowel doesn't have the silent E rule. Like fudge, if you didn't put the D there, it would say fuge. And so there's rules behind this. And these are all things you have to explicitly teach some of these students with reading challenges. Just handing them a worksheet that all has the same pattern doesn't teach them the rule as to why you did that where and what to do whenever you see it again, or how to do that during reading class, not just in spelling class. And also things like TION and SION. When we hear shun at the end of a word, it is never SHUN. The word shun is S-H-U-N. But if they hear shun at the end of a word, it is never, ever, ever S-H-U-N. And these are things that we have to explicitly teach our kids so that when they start to write S-H-U-N and you say, what was my rule? And you go, oh, it can never end like that. So what are my two choices? Oh, okay, it has to be one of these two. Which one's more common? Usually T-I-O-N. Which one do you do if it says jeune, like television? Oh, it has to be S-I-O-N. That's the only one with the zh. And there are many, many, many rules in English. And we don't realize how many there are until you try to teach a kid to read who doesn't naturally pick them up, and you have to explicitly tell them all these rules. But you can also focus on just the main ones. So that's what we're going to do tonight, is mostly the main ones. And the ones that might be tricky that you as a teacher may not notice the pattern for, those are the ones that I'm presenting on today. So first up are syllable types. These are the things I had no idea existed before I started working at a school for kids with dyslexia and started doing far too many hours and days and months and weeks in classes, taking extra courses on how to teach a kid with dyslexia, because it's a very different way of teaching that in all my years of teaching in multiple schools that were great schools, no one ever showed me how to do this. So one of which is closed. So when we think about a closed syllable, that means that there is one vowel and then it is closed in after the vowel with at least one consonant, like at. That would be considered a closed syllable. After the A is a T. It closes it in. We don't care about the front. We only care about the end. This is the most common spelling pattern, which is why in every Orton-Gillingham based, that's the research behind systematic phonics instruction, they always start with those closed syllables. It is the most commonly found in English. So if you teach kids to read those closed syllables like pot and dog and spring, if you can teach them some of those patterns, then you can find there are many, many words they can read. Usually when we think about this, we think about those little kindergarten words, but sometimes there are actually two-syllable words too. So they can read words like combat just by knowing the closed syllables, by knowing that every time you see the vowel closed in by at least one consonant, that it's going to have that short sound. So we think about words like cut, glass, pond, nutmeg. We know what sound those vowels make because I know where to break them apart, and we'll go over a bit of that. And then I see that because my vowel's closed in by a consonant or more than one, that it has to make the short sound. Vowel consonant E, also known as silent E. The one tricky part is a lot of kids are taught this, but they're taught it always happens at the end of a word. That's not necessarily true. It's at the end of a syllable. So if you think about a word like stovepipe, a lot of times those are compound words, but if you don't teach them that it can happen in the middle of a word, a kid won't think to look at it. So they might think that they saw 3 different vowels, so there must be 3 different syllables. They might say stove-ep-ipe. Trust me, I've heard it. They say things like stove-ep-ipe because they break it up differently. So you have to teach them that silent E's aren't necessarily at the end of a word. They can be at the end of a syllable as well. So we think about things like fame and fuse. So those have our vowel consonant E. So the kids actually learn it this way with the strategies that we teach them. We use Wilson Reading System here. They actually learn with the vowels are a different color so that they can see where the vowels are in the consonants.
Sure. Something like stovepipe, is that always going to happen with a compound word though?
Frequently, I know I've seen at least one word where it's actually not a compound word, but usually it's compound words. There's 1 or 2 random ones that really have it otherwise, but typically it's because they used to be a word on its own and it was at the end, but then we compounded it over the years. Open syllables. So when we teach an open syllable, that means that the vowel is the last letter within that syllable, so it can say its name loud and proud. I teach these things in cutesy, quirky little ways because I teach mostly 1st through 5th graders. Now I've got all the way up to 8th graders. I have to completely change some of my cutesiness for them. That's a whole different ball of wax. So one of the things I like to tell them is that when it's closed in, they're trapped. They can just go ah and eh and ah. They can't really say their whole sound. But when they are wide open, they can yell out their name. Like when they're outside, they're loud and proud and they can say their name. So those would be, sometimes it happens in the form of a prefix at the beginning of a word, like pre-test. There might be an embedded prefix like program or begin, or it could just be a word like no and go. So there's nothing happening after my vowel. So the vowel gets to say its full long sound.
How is begin different than pond?
Okay, so pond has only one vowel, so we know that it has to say the short sound because it's closed in by other consonants there. So there's the only sound option that we have is for it to say the ah sound. So typically the number of vowels are often associated with how many syllables if they're separated vowels. So begin has two separated vowels. They're not working together as a team. So we know there has to be two different syllables.
Yeah, I guess I meant like
How would you decide where to break it? Is that what you mean?
if you couldn't, if you were having trouble and you were looking and you knew that if there's a consonant afterwards, there's G.
So that's when you have to teach cognitive flexibility. You have to teach them that their brains have a choice of what they decide, and so they might read it the wrong way. So I actually teach them to do it both ways. What if it was a closed syllable, and then they would go beg in, and I say, does beg in, is that a word that you know? And they go, mm-mm. Okay, how else could you break it? Oh, I could break it here. And I know that if I break it right after my letter E, then instead of it saying now it has a different rule. It means it has to say E because now it's the last letter in my syllable. So that you are correct. That could be confusing for a student, and that's when you teach them both ways. And so you teach them, if I break it here, what would I say? If I broke it here, what would I say? And so it's teaching them that if they're sounding out a word on their own, that they have the choice on how they break it. And if something really doesn't make sense, change your choice. Figure it out a different way. Is this complicated? Is it annoying? Absolutely. But you teach them that this is life. I had one of the girls today that this is actually what I taught her today, was that you have a choice. When you have an open syllable, sometimes it might be a closed syllable, sometimes it might be open, and you don't really know until you try it, especially if you haven't had a lot of exposure to text. This little girl came to me starting in 5th grade and couldn't read cat, hat, nap, any of those kind of words. And now she's a 6th grader, and now we've reached words like begin. And so she goes, oh, now there's choices. Why are there so many rules? And so it can be a little frustrating to them, but the fact is she was able to do it. I gave her a nonsense word. So nonsense meaning there was no way for her to use her own like outside context clues to figure out what word it might be. And I made her break it up 2 different ways, and she was able to do it perfectly fine all on her own because she knew what the rules were. So it was frustrating to know that there are so many rules, but she can actually read now when last year she couldn't read anything. And so it is a lot and can be inundating, but you also have to remember I'm teaching you all of this tonight in like an hour and a half, whereas students like this, we work with them for usually 2 to 3 years. So you wouldn't teach them all in one day. So you would start with one, work on that for a month or 2, start with the next one, work on that for a month or 2, and so forth. So these go in order as to how frequent they are. So if you're thinking about why I'm going in this order, it has to do with how frequently you would see these kinds of patterns within words. So the next one is final stable syllables. So those are ones that they always follow the same rule and generally make the same sounds. So we think about things like bubble and bugle, where they have a consonant LE. So the consonant might change, but they all end with that LE pattern. So you're working on it different ways. And then we think about words like vacation and fusion. So when we hear those sounds at the end of a word, we know that it's always, your syllable break is always going to be right in front of that S-I-O-N or right in front of the T-I-O-N. So then suddenly a word like vacation that looks really long, if they know that every time they see that T-I-O-N at the end, it's always going to say shun, then suddenly they only have to read vacay, vacation. And if they're spelling it, what is the base word of that? Vacate, to leave. If you're on vacation, you left. So if you teach them some vocabulary in with some of these skills, like vacation comes from the base word vacate. Oh, I know it has to be the T-I-O-N one. It can't be the S-I-O-N one because vacate ended with a T. And so they have to think about all these different things. You teach them a little tiny bit at a time, not to overwhelm them, little itty bits at a time. But once kids start to figure out the patterns, it all starts to make sense to them. So as I was going through my years of training, there was one little boy that I worked with, and I taught him for, okay, we must be going on at least 4 years now. I taught him how to read, and now I'm just teaching him how to do school. And so when I was working with him just 6 months ago, he goes, you know, you taught me all those rules, but like, I don't think about them anymore. I just read books. And I went, hallelujah, that means I did my job. There's this code and there's all these rules, and it sounds really overwhelming that they have to think about all these rules while they're reading. And he went to his mom when I first started teaching him, and he goes, hey, Miss Parnello, like, I know what you listen to her, it sounds like it's crazy talk, but it makes sense to me. I get it. And so now that we've been working together for so long, he's like, actually, I don't even think about the rules anymore. I just know how to read. And that's really what we want to get our kids to do. They have to figure out the rules and the code on how to get there, but once they figure it out, they don't really have to think about this every word that they read, but they will be able to think about these rules when they hit a word they don't know. When they open their history book or their science book that is full of things completely out of a context that they know and full of a lot more challenging vocabulary and a lot of names of places and people, things that they can't just figure out from context, or some of those science words with the Greek and Latin roots within them. So we really need to teach them for what to do when they get to a word that they don't know. How are they going to sound them out? Next up are R-controlled vowels. So A-R, O-R, E-R, I-R, U-R. So the last three, E-R, I-R, and U-R, they all make the same exact sound. They all say Sometimes a kid will go eh-er, it-er, but they don't really realize they all make the same exact sound. The most common one being the E-R sound. I-R and U-R are usually in the middle of words. So things like this are how you teach the kids to spell. You teach them where is the most common place you would find that. We generally don't end words with IR and UR except for like those one syllable words like fur like a dog, or a fir tree. Those are the only ones I can really think of. And her. So some of those one syllable words might end with it, but in general, if you hear ones where there's an in the middle of a word, it's usually the IR or the UR. And teaching them the patterns to it, of where are you more likely to find that. And so those are some of the trickier things. And then suddenly, like the sound E. I told you that there were 9 ways to spell E, but you teach them when you might use each one. And you can knock off half that list because of where you hear it within the word, and it narrows down the choices. And that's really what we want our kids to know. Double letter teams, or double vowel teams, or they might call them vowel diphthongs. There's 8 million different ways you can call this. So often teachers will teach this as 2 vowels go walking and the first one does the talking. That's a real great strategy if kiddos have nothing. But that's only true about half the time. Because sometimes there's words like ow, O-W. It doesn't say O. Or if we see E-A, sometimes it does say E, but it can also say eh, and it can also say A. So if a kiddo has no strategies to go off of, 2 vowels go walking and the first one does the talking. And I even taught this in my first several years of teaching. I even did a little thing. 2 vowels go walking, the first one does the talking, and I have a whole little hand motion. And now I never teach that. I teach them what the different teams are and what sounds they might say. So there's some basic rules for how we're going to divide a word into syllables. So we have these 6 syllable types, and we tell a kiddo, don't sound out the word till you break it apart first, so you know the rule for each kind of syllable that's in front of you. But the rules, some kids can kind of figure out, but other kids not so much. So there are some basic generalizations. I'm going to go with generalizations because there's always an exception to the rule. And in fact, I showed you the 6 syllable types. There's an exception to every single one of them. So we're going on big picture here. First of which, compound words. You break it up where one word ends and the next one begins. Most kids kind of pick this up. They can kind of figure them out. This is an easy place to start. When you're talking about syllable division, I actually always start with compound words, and I use them to help the kids see. I help them see that I had 2 vowels separated by some consonants. So we're going to break between the 2 consonants. We had 2 vowels with consonants in the middle. We're going to split up those consonants and break them apart. So I teach them using words that they already know, they can already read on their own, so that they can just see the pattern. So we split between consonants and double letters. Generally, if you have separated vowels, except for silent E, of course, it means that those are different syllables. So when we look at a word like admit, there were 2 consonants in the middle, a D and an M, so I'm going to split between them. In the word snuggle, there are 2 G's, so I'm going to split between them. Snuggle. We don't really enunciate both G's. That's actually a spelling rule. Otherwise, it would be a snoogle without the extra D. So when we talk about the word snuggle, sometimes kids will be like, well, why do I double it sometimes and not the other? There's a rule for that too. If I took away the G, remember how I just told you an open syllable says its name. So if I don't have that extra G, it becomes snoo. And then my consonant LE has to stay together. So we don't want a snoogle, we want a snuggle. We also want to keep blends together and digraphs. And it helps if you can see the prefixes in there too. So non meaning not. But if you're a little kiddo, you won't really understand prefixes yet. The general rule is I see that my ST should probably stick together because it's a blend that goes nicely and smoothly together. So because NS isn't really a blend in our language. We don't really do that too commonly, maybe at the end when you add a suffix. And then lock it. I'm going to keep the CK together. It's a digraph. Lock it. And blends usually go with the second syllable. 100. Construct. So we keep that STR blend together. So teaching which sounds sound nicely together, and those are where your breaks are. And a lot of times, even if they were to break up a word like construct in the wrong place, all the vowels will still make the right noise. If they added like construct, they could generally put it back together in their brains well enough to figure it out. But we want to teach them the rules of STR is a blend that sounds smooth together, so we keep it together. So this one I'm going to read word for word. It's by Louisa Moats, how to read. So awareness and use of such organizational patterns, not memorization of rules, facilitates learning. And the goal of insight is to read more fluently, not recite orthographic trivia. Sometimes critics of phonics instruction lament that there are too many rules to teach. The rules don't always apply, and the rules are too complicated to be taught. This criticism is apt if the correspondence system is conceived as a series of letter sequence rules instead of a layered system representing both sound and meaning. So when we think about it, it's not that I want my kid to recite every rule. It's that we want these students to be able to see that there are rules, that there is some sort of logic. Because our kiddos come in going, there are all these letters and they don't make any sense and I don't ever know which one to use when. And so we just want them to see that there are patterns, that there is a logic to the system. Is it a convoluted logic? Yes. But I would much rather my student by the end of the program say, I don't remember any of my syllable types, but I can read. And that's what I want them to do. I want them to read. I want them to notice when there's a rule that they can apply, when there is a way to attack a word that they don't know how to read. We want our students to really be able to see something and know what to do when they get there. High frequency words, those are words that are found very frequently within our language. Those would be a book that a 6-year-old picks up and a book that I pick up to read at night when I'm tired but don't really want to go to sleep quite yet. And these are words that they're going to see all the time and they have to memorize, either because of how frequently they're going to see it, or, and that those would be the ones that follow the rules. For, will, her, how, those all follow rules. OW is a team, ER is a team, ILL says ill. It's got that closed syllable rule, but we see it all the time. So we don't want to sound it out every single time we see it. We just need to commit it to memory because we're going to see it so often, I can't sound it out every time I'm reading it. Sometimes they don't follow the rules, and that's why they're a high frequency word that we memorize, because it's to be the cause of something. There is a logic in there somewhere, but you see it all the time and it's not something that the kids would notice. And you need them to remember that put, you usually says it doesn't say put, unless you add the extra T. This says put. So we need them to memorize some of these things. And the way that we do this is multi-sensory instruction. So we're talking about remapping a kid's brain, getting their brain to work differently. And that has to do with how we're teaching them too. So it's all about using as many senses as you can. So we want tactile, so something you can touch. We want gross motor, and we want verbal auditory. So gross motor being the difference of, fine motor is what you do with a pencil, little tiny movements with your hands. Gross motor uses your arms and your whole body and using larger limbs. And it's a different pattern of muscle memory. It's the reason they say once you learn to ride a bike, you can always ride a bike. We have a biking program here, and one of the teachers bailed one morning because something came up. And they suckered me into doing the bike program with the kids, being here at 6:30 in the morning and going for a bike ride. Do you know the last time I rode a bike? Pretty sure it was about a week before I got my driver's license. I own a bike. It's in the shed somewhere. Have not gotten on it. And somehow I'm going on a bike ride with 12 kids and another teacher at 6:30 in the morning last week. I, shockingly, could ride a bike. I didn't fall off. I didn't crash. I didn't slam into a child. I was really proud of myself. Can't say I was all that great at the hand signals, so it was really good I was in the back. But it's one of those things that I remembered how to do it because it is gross motor memory. It is what your body can easily remember to do. It is a very different way of memory compared to fine motor. So when we want to teach sight words, we use things like gross motor. So we hold our elbows and use 2 fingers and we draw the words out and say them as we go. So we go S, H, E, she. And we might even write it on a whiteboard like that so the kids are tracing it with their eyes as they're doing it. And because they're seeing it, they're saying it, and they're doing a gross motor movement, you're now activating 3 senses of the brain. So that suddenly changes it from being this random set of letters on a page to being something that gets embedded in their minds. We could also do tactile. These are my favorite. Yes, I'm a Wilson trainer, but this has nothing to do with why I love these things. These are called gel boards, and they have little magnetic pens, so you can do a word like who, W-H-O, and then they use their fingers, and they go W-H-O, who. And you say, oh, look, it's not gone yet. You have to do it again. And they go W-H-O, who. So they're seeing it, they're touching it, they're saying it. That's 3 senses of the brain and helps them to practice. So these are really cool. They're by Wilson Language. They're gel boards. You can also make them out of Ziploc baggies, and you can put, not with a magnetic component, but you can put like hair gel and put a little food coloring and put it in a zippy bag. Make sure you put like packaging tape around it in case it pops. I've learned this lesson. And they can draw within it too, and draw on their like little baggie full of gel, because when you put it on a table that you can see the letters in the same format. It's a fun way to do it. And they also have those like silly toys from the 80s where it's like a plasticky thing and a little plastic pencil and you lift it up and it erases. Those work as well. I don't know the actual word for them. I just remember playing with them as a child. So encoding strategies. Those would be for spelling. First of all, teaching them to take away the suffix. Willingly, what's your base word? Will. All right, spell will. Okay, what's the next one? Ing. Ing is always ing. And then lee. Spell backs. This one I find to be really important because the kid's like, well, I can spell backs. There's like 3 sounds. B-ax, B-A-X. I got it. But wait a minute. It's not backs. It is you have a back, I have a back. Together we have backs. So we have to teach them to spell the word back first. And they can apply the rule, oh, CK is what we use at the end of a 1-syllable word in a closed syllable. And then I'm going to add an S because there's more than one. If you just told them to sound that out, they would have given you BAX. Location, thinking about locate being that base word. Where are your syllables? If you're trying to get a kid to spell comprehend, I can guarantee you they will leave out some letters. But if you go, what are your syllables? And I make them put down their pencils. Sometimes I rip them out of their hands ever so kindly, not in a mean way. And I will take their pen away and say, okay, tell me the syllables. And we'll touch them on the table. And they go, comprehend. All right, what was your first syllable? Com. All right, spell it. C-O-M. Next syllable, pre. How would you spell that? P-R-E. Last one, hend. H-E-N-D. Sometimes the kids can do that whole thing orally and then write it down. Sometimes they say a syllable, write it. Say the next syllable, write it. It all depends on the working memory of the kid you're working with. I've had some kids that can do the whole the whole thing out loud and then remember the whole thing on paper. Others you have to do one chunk at a time. Depends on your kid. And then you can also have them tap out the individual sounds. So like a word like sprint, usually they'll forget something, whether it's the P or the R, or they'll forget the end and it turns into spit or sprint, spr something or other. But you can teach them to tap it out. This is one of the fundamental elements of the program that we use here. So it'd be s, p, r, in, t, and teaching them to hear every letter and touch what they were, and then go to write it. This is where I was talking about there are rules. C is our standard k sound in our language. It's found at the end of multisyllabic words, like panic, or hectic, or at the beginning of words like cat. When we can't use a C, those are when there's an E, I, or Y after it. So like kite and bake. I couldn't have used a C, or it would have changed noises and become an S sound and done the S. And then I also don't use them after R controlled vowels, like park and fork. CK, I use in short vowel words that are one syllable words. Or if it became a compound word, like we pointed out with stovepipe, it used to be the end of a word. If I think about like matchstick, it is a multisyllabic word, but the word stick was a word all by itself, so I didn't suddenly change how it's spelled when I turned it into a matchstick. The letters V and J can't end words. So I'm teaching you some of the secret rules for spelling that some of our kiddos won't naturally pick up. So we are never allowed to end with a V in English. That's why we have words like have and give. And of course I had a kid whose language was from like Arabic or something and ended with a V last year. That got real interesting. He's like, but my name ends with a V. And I had to remind him, your name is not in English. I love you dearly, but you're breaking the rules and kind of messing with me here. And then that's when we teach them that different languages have different rules. And so we have to use DGE or GE if it makes the J sound. So teaching them just the simple rule of it will never end with a J. It will never end with a V really makes a difference. And how to spell the K sounds. DGE and TCH are used after short vowels, like itch and which and pitch and pitcher. So those are all different ways that we would use them. The reason that one is so hard to remember is because the words that follow the rule we don't use as often as the ones that don't follow the rule. We think about words like much and such and rich, and those are more common words in our language, and those are the rule breakers. So it makes it really hard for us to remember our real rule because we don't use it as often as the rule breakers. I talked about this earlier. We don't actually end with shun. So if they feel like they should end with shun at the end of a longer word, their only choices are T-I-O-N and S-I-O-N. And the more common one is the one with a T. Resistant students. So this is where we think about those kids who are in that fight, flight, or freeze. Reading has become, and spelling have become traumatic events they feel the need to escape from because they just can't handle it. It is emotionally too taxing. So what causes that? Repeated failure. If you know you've gotten it wrong the last 100 times, what are the odds you're going to want to do it in time number 101? Teachers' responses to things, or students' responses to things. They might be, say, you're teasing. Oh, you need to try harder. You're just not focusing. We've done this 100 times. Don't you know how to do this? If you could just think a little harder and try to remember, I just did this with you yesterday. But if the method you used with them yesterday didn't work, then you have to think about your teaching methods. What is a different way that you could teach it to them? And repeating the same method of instruction and expecting a different result. So a lot of times students are retained or held back if they're not making progress. But guess what that means? That student's doing the same thing that didn't work the first time. That same exact reading program, they're doing it all over again and it didn't work the first time. So you're just hoping a little bit more of it sticks. So it's all about changing your methods and work beyond their ability level. If they keep getting bumped up a grade level but no one ever went back and taught them the foundations of reading, they're going to shut down because they know that every word on that page they can't read, so why bother? Anxiety. So repeated failure causes that anxiety piece. Inability to access books of interest. So having a kid who really likes history but can't read words like cat, hat, dog, so he can't read any of those nonfiction, harder, more difficult text might be really hard for them. So then they become resistant because all the books they can read are about things they don't want to read about. So you want to help them by finding books that are just right at their level. But at the same time, sometimes just right books aren't a motivator. So if a kid's willing to try on a harder book, give them a chance. I've seen some teachers be like, no, that's not at your level. You're a level K reader and that's a level V book. You can't read that one. That's not within your zone. You can't do that one. If a kid who can't read wants to read a book, oh goodness gracious, please let them read a book. I've had so many students where I've had to contact their teacher. This child has dyslexia. They will always mess up words on a page. If you only give them books they can only read with 98% accuracy, they will only read baby books for the rest of their life. Please just let them read something that they want to read. Do you know how many years it's taken me to get this kid to want to read anything? So we really want to get our kids to want to love reading. That's really the big core of this. If they love to do it, they're more motivated to try and overcome those challenges. Change the level of difficulty. If they refuse to read the books in class, maybe give them something else. See if there's a reason. Maybe it's just too hard for them. Give them something a little bit simpler, but still within their level of interest. Giving them opportunities for success. So controlled text. Giving them books that have words that are only patterns that they've learned or mostly patterns they've learned, also known as called decodable books, or they have high-low books is sometimes what they're called, where they're high interest but low decoding abilities. Using a different instructional strategy. If it didn't work the first time, maybe try a different approach. And reading interesting books out loud. My group of readers last year that couldn't read the words like cat, hat, and dog and those simple closed syllable, I read them really rich text that was at grade level, and for the first time in their lives they heard grade level text because they were always pulled out of class during reading group, and so they never got to read or hear any of these interesting stories. So we read books like Bridge to Terabithia, and we read A Fish in a Tree about a 5th grader who finally learns that she has dyslexia, and what it was like for her when she had to teach her all these different ways, like tapping out her words and drawing them in the sand. And we ended up reading books like, I loved A Tangle of Knots. That was a really good one. And it's got foreshadowing and all these rich things that you can teach them. So I'm also teaching them to read. But in the last few minutes of class every day, I read them really rich text with high vocabulary and really high comprehension skills so that they're still catching up to their peers and being able to read cool books that their classmates are reading. So where can you begin as a teacher? What can you take away from this tonight? So assessment. You got to know what they know and what they don't. So we want them to know, okay, they can do this, but this is where they fall apart. We want them to know, you want to know nonsense words. I couldn't figure this out, why they always put nonsense words on that kindergarten Dibbles assessment when I was an early teacher. It didn't make sense to me. I'm like, what? That's gibberish. Why would that matter? Because you can't fake a nonsense word. If you have a student who can read a nonsense word, that means they know how letters and sounds work. It means they can read words out of context. Nonsense words are where your kids who have really good visual memory completely fall apart. They can read the entire book just based on the context clues and the pictures, but you give them one word in isolation that was in that book and they can't read it. And so we really want to get to the heart of it. There's a free assessment that you can download that'll break it down where you can do reading and spelling tests. And I'll show you the recording form. You can download them completely for free. You have to give them like your email address or something, but you can download the entire assessment and teacher guide for it, where it gives you a list of words and you can focus on initial sounds, final sounds, blends, and there's a beginning one as well as an advanced one. And these are completely free that you can download as a teacher with that link. And they also have ones with more difficult spelling patterns too, and there's an advanced list as well. So that's a good place to start, is being able to have some resources and to know where your kids are and where your starting point is, because maybe you can skip over certain patterns they already know. And then systematic phonics programs, that's the kind of program I've been teaching you tonight, which is ones that have a pattern and a logic to the sequence of their phonics instruction. They are all based off of the Orton-Gillingham methods and research. They're structured, multisensory, and systematic and cumulative. Each one builds on itself. Some of the more popular ones are Barton, Lindemood Bell, Orton-Gillingham, OG, Slingerland, Spire, and Wilson Reading System. I put them in alphabetical order, by the way.
What do you recommend when your school structure does not allow for a phonics intervention program, but kids don't know how to read? Sneak it in, push the admins, like.
I would push the admins if I could. If you can't, sneak it in as you're teaching them. So as you hear a kid get stuck on a word, then you can insert it into your conversation. So, hey, do you see how there's another consonant after that vowel? That means I have to say the short sound. I have to say ah. And just slowly, as they get stuck, it doesn't work as effectively, but at least they can see that there's a pattern and a rule and you can do what you've got To give you some perspective, I taught in public school for 3 years before switching to private school, where I can kind of do whatever I want in terms of like whatever my kid needs, I get to do if it's effective, of course, not like just willy-nilly, of course. So I completely understand where you're coming from. That's where I couldn't teach my kid to spell his own name Max, because nobody taught me as a teacher how to do that. But it's that kind of thing. So if you can kind of like sneak it in, or sometimes there is some sort of phonics instruction, but it's not really explicit, you can add in verbally as the kid gets stuck. So multisensory instruction, you see it, you hear it, you touch it, you say it. So it uses so many parts of the brain, it sticks better and has better recognition. You can practice things like skywriting. You can write on the tables. My kids love this. So most school tables are laminate, and so I can actually take a dry erase marker and write on the table, and the kids can trace it away with their fingers and say it, and it completely wipes off. You have to make sure you don't accidentally grab a Sharpie, and I can just use like Clorox wipes or like method non-toxic spray stuff that's not all like, you know, poisonous in the air, and you can wipe down the tables, and it's really easy, and the kids absolutely love it. Letter tiles. So originally when I started teaching, before I learned the official rules for everything, I used Making Words, which has little letter tiles that you can cut apart, and the kids learn their spelling patterns that way using the Making Words book. And then now in Wilson we use magnetic letter tiles, where they move the letters around and manipulate the sounds within words. Gel boards, that's the thing I was using earlier, and if you can't or don't have the funds to do it, if you have a whole class full of kids, you can do Ziploc baggies with hair gel inside it with some, you know, squirty food coloring. Be warned, do not let the kids pop them. You've been warned. Instructional resources, sound literacy app. It's the equivalent of the magnetic board, and but it's online, it's digital, and you can download it. It's $9.99, I believe it is. This is something you have to use as a teaching tool. It doesn't do anything, it's just a pile of letters, and you verbally teach the student and work with them, but it's a way of using all those different letter tiles with the different colors between vowels and consonants. Phonics Genius, that one really is more of a teaching tool that uses the structured literacy and teaching of the rules. That one's pretty low cost. And then Phonics Simplex Spelling, that one is another one that's really good for practicing the spelling rules, and they go in that systematic order, so the kids can start at one level and go across. And then there are also free decodable books, and those are the ones that I was talking about, giving them something more at their level, and that entire website is completely free. And so some of the pictures are a little cheesy and corny because, you know, if you're doing everything for free, but it's a good starting point if you don't have much as a teacher and need to start somewhere. And then professional development opportunities. We actually do Wilson training here on site at CHC to learn how to use the Wilson reading system in order to teach the systematic phonics program. So we do introductory courses, which are 3 days, or the full certification is a year. Okay. And then there's some of the links to some great resources like the International Dyslexia Association, both the main branch as well as the local branch. And they have a lot of free events that are local and also like paid conferences and stuff. And then that's the link to the brain study that I was referencing earlier today. And then Reading A to Z is RAS kids. The kids can play on iPads and that kind of thing. It's relatively low cost. It's $100 for 35 licenses. I always used, like, that would be like the core chunk of my class budget I would use each year. And then I just did other things on my own dime, like crayons and that kind of thing. So that one's a good resource for leveled reading. And now it's time for question and answers. And if you don't have any, you are free to go. And if you have questions, I'm here to answer them. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, like, when our students are diagnosed with I'm at a Catholic school, but when our students are diagnosed with dyslexia, they always just say like specific learning disability.
Yeah.
What, you know, how do you know who has dyslexia and who has something else, or what does that, how does that work?
So that is twofold. Part of it is saying the word dyslexia opens them up to needing to have different services in a public school setting. And is also the fact that dyslexia is not part of the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual for disorders. And so that is also part of it, is if they're going manual, the word dyslexia isn't necessarily in there anymore. It's now just considered a reading disorder. So typically if it says SLD in reading or a disorder of reading, that means dyslexia. Or if it says disorder of writing, then that means they have dysgraphia, which is the written component of it, where they might be able to read, but they can't spell.
Right.
So does that help a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, are there other things that it would be, or really the same thing?
It's really about the same thing. As a lot of it is language in terms of like what services they are ending up required to provide by saying words like dyslexia. So a neuropsychologist would give a diagnosis like dyslexia, but a school district would typically just say a disorder of reading.